After my son's funeral, I inherited his old SUV while his wife seized millions of dollars and kicked me out of the house. When I got into the vehicle, an automated voice message suddenly played. My son's voice came through the speakers. "Follow the GPS coordinates." Then the GPS screen suddenly turned on by itself, leading me to a place she never wanted me to see. I spent 31 years running electrical service calls for half the houses in this county, rewiring old panels, chasing shorts through walls nobody wanted to open up. The kind of work where you learn that the thing that finally breaks a house is never the flashy thing. It's always the wire nobody checked, tucked behind a wall, doing its slow damage for years before the lights start flickering. I didn't know it yet, but I'd spent the last 2 years living inside exactly that kind of house, and I hadn't checked a single wire. My son was 36 when he died. He was sharper than me in every way that mattered. The kind of mind that could look at a spreadsheet the way I looked at a breaker box and see the fault before it ever tripped. He built a small logistics company out of a rented office and turned it into something that paid for a house on a hill I never fully believed he owned. He married a woman 4 years ago who I tried for a long time to like. He'd met her at a trade conference in another state, a detail I only know because he told it to me once at a barbecue in his backyard, laughing about how she'd corrected his math on a slide before he'd even properly introduced himself. I liked that story. I liked imagining a woman sharp enough to catch a mistake in a room full of people who wanted to be impressed. What I didn't understand for years was that being sharp and being kind aren't the same thing, and I'd let the first one stand in for the second because it was easier than admitting I didn't actually know her at all. By the time he died, the company had 11 employees and a warehouse lease he was 3 years into, and I still couldn't have told you, if you'd asked me at the funeral, exactly what his software did. He'd tried to explain it to me more than once, something about routing delivery trucks more efficiently across 3 states, and I'd nodded along the way. You nod along when someone you love is proud of something you don't fully understand, which is its own kind of failure I didn't recognize until much later. I told myself the coldness I felt off his wife was just a personality thing, that some people aren't warm, that some people show love through spreadsheets and thank you cards instead of hugs. I told myself a lot of things I should have looked at harder. The morning of the funeral, I woke up before my alarm and lay there in the dark for a long time before I could make myself get up. I put on the only black suit I own, the one I'd worn to bury my own wife 9 years earlier, and I drove to the church alone because there wasn't anyone left to drive there with anymore. My son's wife arrived 20 minutes late in a car I didn't recognize, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and she spent the service checking her phone twice that I saw. I told myself she was checking on funeral logistics, family calling in, flowers being delivered late. I was still, even then, giving her the benefit of every doubt I had left. After the service, people gathered at the house on the hill for the reception, the house I'd helped my son paint one long weekend before he ever had the money to hire someone else to do it. His wife stood by the door, greeting people with a composed, gracious sadness that looked from a distance exactly like grief. Up close, I noticed her eyes never actually reddened, not once. I've cried at gas stations over less than what I was watching her walk through, and I kept waiting for the moment it would catch up to her, the moment the composure would crack. It never did. My son's aunt, my late wife's sister, cornered me by the drink table about halfway through the afternoon and asked, quietly, whether I'd noticed how calm his wife was being. I told her grief hits people differently, that some people hold it together in public and fall apart later, alone, where nobody can see it. She looked at me for a long moment like she wanted to say something else, then just nodded and let it go. I've thought about that look more times in the month since than I can count. She saw something that afternoon that I wasn't ready to see yet. 3 days after the funeral, I got a call asking me to come to the lawyer's office to go over the will. I assumed this was a formality, something I'd sit through for 20 minutes before going home to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. My son's wife texted me the address like I hadn't been the one who used to drive my son to school every morning for 12 years. I didn't say anything back except that I'd be there. The night before, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold and thought about the last real conversation I'd had with my son 6 weeks before he died. He'd called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday, which wasn't like him, and asked if I still had the title to the old service truck sitting in his garage. I told him of course I did. It had been sitting there for years, and he laughed and said, "Good, hang on to that." And then the conversation moved on to something else, something about a football game, and I never thought about it again until the day I was handed a different set of keys entirely. The lawyer had been my son's from the very first year of the company, brought on originally to handle a contract dispute with an early supplier, and he'd stayed with him ever since, the kind of relationship built on more than just billable hours. He looked older than I remembered from the one other time we'd met, gray creeping fully into his beard now, and there was something apologetic in the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes when I first sat down, like he already knew exactly how badly the numbers in front of him were about to land on me. The lawyer's office smelled like fresh carpet and old money, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap while my son's wife sat across from me in a black dress that still had the tags cut off that morning, a little plastic tag caught in the seam near her hip. When the lawyer read out the house, the accounts, and the trust fund, all of it going to her, she didn't blink. When he got to me, he cleared his throat like he already knew how this was going to land, and said the only asset left in my name was a 2019 SUV registered to my son son, currently parked in the garage. She smiled at that. She actually smiled. "It's practically scrap," she said, sliding the keys across the table like she was tossing change to a valet. "Consider it a parting gift." I picked them up without a word. I'd spent 31 years learning how to keep my face still while a customer yelled at me about a bill I hadn't set, and I used every bit of that training in that room. I thanked the lawyer, shook his hand, and walked out into the parking lot where the SUV sat under a gray sky, parked in the same corner spot where employees leave their cars when they don't expect to be staying long. I stood there with my hand on the door handle for a long minute, working up whatever it took to finally lower myself into that seat. It was the seat my son used to sit in. I could still see the worn spot on the armrest where his elbow used to rest. I sat there a while longer than I needed to, running my thumb over that worn patch of leather before I finally put the key in the ignition. When I finally got in, the dashboard flickered before I'd even turned the key. A stutter of blue light across the display that made me freeze with my hand still on the ignition. Then the speakers crackled, and his voice came through, calm and clear, like he was sitting in the passenger seat instead of 6 feet under a fresh mound of dirt across town. "Dad, if you're hearing this, don't panic and don't call anyone yet. Just drive. Follow the GPS coordinates." My hands were shaking so hard it took me 2 tries to get the key to turn all the way. The screen lit up on its own a few seconds later, a red pin dropping onto a map 40 minutes outside of town, out past the old fairgrounds where nothing had operated since I was younger than my son ever got to be. I sat there with the engine idling, staring at that pin, running through every reasonable explanation. A prank recorded months ago and triggered by some app I didn't understand. A glitch in a system he'd built for something else entirely. I've spent my whole life fixing things by understanding exactly how they're supposed to work, and nothing about this felt like a malfunction. It felt like a message left by someone who'd known exactly what kind of day I was about to have. I didn't tell her I was leaving. I didn't tell anyone. I put the SUV in reverse and pulled out of that parking lot, and for the first time since I'd gotten the phone call about the accident, I felt something other than grief sitting in my chest. I couldn't name it yet. I know now it was the first flicker of the same feeling I used to get opening up a wall to find the wire that had been arcing behind it the whole time. The drive took me past the exit I would have normally taken home, past the diner where my son used to meet me for coffee on Sunday mornings, back when he still had time for Sunday mornings, back before the company grew into something that owned him more than he owned it. The road turned to gravel about a mile past the fairgrounds, and the pin on the screen blinked steady on a long, low row of storage units I had never once heard him mention in 6 years of running a business that apparently needed one. A single office trailer sat near the entrance of the lot, a light on inside despite the hour, and an older man in a company polo watched me from the window as I drove past looking for the row that matched the number on the screen. He didn't come out. I found out much later, from a rental agreement my son's business partner eventually tracked down, that the unit had been paid up in full for 18 months in advance, in cash, with instructions on file that only one person besides my son was ever authorized to access it. Me, Unit 14. The lock on it was newer than the ones on either side of it, a keypad instead of a padlock. The metal around it still bright compared to the rust creeping over the rest of the door. Taped to the inside of the frame, tucked where you'd only see it if you were standing close enough to actually look, was a small laminated card with 6 numbers written in his handwriting. I didn't recognize the sequence at first, then I did. My birthday, the same 6 digits I've used as a joke password on every account I've ever opened, the kind of thing only my son would have known to use as a way of making sure it was me standing there and not someone else. My hand shook entering the code. When the lock clicked and the chain went slack, I pulled the door up and it screamed on its track, a sound that echoed down the row and probably reached the empty fairgrounds a quarter-mile off. Cold, stale air rolled out to meet me, carrying the faint smell of cardboard and old carpet, the smell of a room that had been sealed up and left waiting. Inside, the unit was clean in a way that told me he'd set this up recently, not something forgotten and gathering dust the way most storage units end up. A folding table sat against the back wall, a single lamp unplugged, waiting. A cardboard box sat squarely in the middle of the table with my name written on the side in thick black marker, the same handwriting from the keypad card. I sat down on an overturned plastic crate because my legs didn't feel steady enough to hold me standing, and I reached over and opened the box. The first thing on top was an envelope with my name on it, and beneath that, folders, actual manila folders with labeled tabs, organized the way my son organized everything, alphabetically, methodically, like even in secret he couldn't help but build a filing system. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no more than 4 sentences, telling me not to trust his wife, telling me everything in the box was real, and telling me to call a name I recognized immediately, his old business partner from the early years of the company, before the money got big enough to change things. I set the letter down on the folding table and reached for the first folder. The first folder held a stack of bank statements that didn't match anything the lawyer had read out loud 3 days earlier. Transfers going back 8 months, moving money out of accounts everyone had been told were untouched since the funeral arrangements began. Some of the transfers were small, a few $100s here and there, the kind of amount that wouldn't raise a flag on its own. Others weren't small at all. One line item alone was for $11,000, moved to an account I didn't recognize, dated 3 weeks before my son died. The second folder folder held something I had to read twice before it made any sense to me at all. A printed email chain between my son's wife and an attorney, whose signature line described her practice as focusing on capacity proceedings, dated back to March, 5 months before anything had happened to my son. I didn't know what the phrase meant. I had spent 31 years around electrical code language dense enough to make anyone's eyes glaze over, and even I had to read the definition at the top of the first email twice before my stomach dropped all the way down through the folding chair beneath me. Capacity proceedings, the attorney had explained in plain language clearly meant for a client who wasn't a lawyer herself, were how a family member could petition a court to strip an aging relative of control over their own finances and medical decisions, all filed under the language of protecting them. The email walked through the process step by step, what kind of medical evaluation would be needed, what kind of judge tended to be sympathetic, how long the whole thing typically took from filing to a ruling. There was a third folder underneath the first two, thinner than the others, holding printouts of text messages between my son's wife and someone whose number wasn't saved under any name I recognized, just initials. Most of the messages were logistics, appointment times, a reference to paperwork being ready by a certain date. One message, sent the week of the funeral itself, before the body had even been released for burial, read simply that the timeline could move up now that things had been, in her words, simplified. I read that word 4 or 5 times, simplified. I understood, sitting there on the crate with cold air coming through the gap under the door, that my son's death hadn't slowed this plan down at all. If anything, it had cleared the last obstacle out of its way. I kept reading. There were notes further down the chain from an actual consultation, dated the week the funeral arrangements had already been finalized, that laid out something closer to a timeline than a legal strategy. Get the will settled first. Let the grief run its course for a month or two so nobody starts asking uncomfortable questions. Then quietly begin the paperwork on the father-in-law, framed the whole way through as concern, framed as love, framed as the responsible thing to do for a man everyone around her would assume was too old and too broken by his own son's death to argue back. I sat there in the cold with the folder open on my knees and understood all at once that I had been thinking about this whole thing backwards. I had been sitting in that storage unit assuming she'd taken everything that mattered and left me with scraps out of spite, a cruel little insult on top of an unbearable loss. That wasn't what this was. The scraps weren't the insult. The scraps were bait. She hadn't been building a case against my son at all. In her plans, by the time any of this paperwork would actually matter, he was already gone, already spent, already a line item she had moved past on her way to the next thing. The proceedings she'd been quietly assembling for 5 months weren't about the assets he had left behind when he died. They were paperwork to have a doctor evaluate me, paperwork to argue, in front of a judge who would have no reason to doubt her, that I couldn't manage my own affairs anymore, that grief and age had finally caught up to the old man everyone already half expected to fall apart, paperwork that would let her take control of a rental property 2 towns over, that my son had quietly put half my name on 11 months earlier, specifically, I now understood, so that she couldn't touch it if anything ever happened to him first. I found the deed transfer further back in the folder, dated 10 months before he died, my name added as joint owner with no explanation attached to it anywhere in the file, no note, nothing. He hadn't told me because telling me would have meant explaining why, and explaining why would have meant admitting out loud that he'd already started to suspect the woman he was married to. He'd protected me quietly instead, the same way he used to fix things around my house without ever mentioning he'd noticed they were broken. I thought about a dinner, maybe 8 months before he died, his wife asking me gently whether I'd been forgetting things lately, whether I'd noticed myself repeating stories, whether I'd thought about seeing someone just to be safe. I'd laughed it off at the time, told her I was sharp as I'd ever been, and she'd smiled and said she just worried about me. Living alone, nobody checking in. I had filed that conversation away under the heading of a caring daughter-in-law. Sitting in that cold unit with the folder still spread open in my lap, I understood I'd been filed away that night too, quietly, into a category she was building a case for one gentle question at a time. None of this was ever about him. It was about me. I put the folder down and sat very still in that cold storage unit for longer than I want to admit, listening to the wind pull at the loose edge of the door I hadn't pulled all the way shut. Then I picked up the letter again, found the name he'd written down, and called it. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting for this call for longer than I had any idea. "I've been wondering when you'd find that unit," he said, and there was something rough in his voice, the sound of a man who had also been carrying something heavy for months without anyone to hand it to. "Your son set that whole thing up over the last year. I helped him get some of it together. I didn't know exactly when you'd go looking or if you ever would. I asked him how much he knew. He was quiet for a second before he answered. Enough to know your son wasn't imagining things," he said, "and enough to know we should talk in person, not on the phone. We met the next afternoon at a diner 2 exits off the highway, not the one my son used to take me to, a different one, neutral ground neither of us had any history with. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the kind of handshake that told you he'd worked with his hands at some point before a desk job took over his life. He'd known my son since the company was 3 people crammed into a rented office above a dry cleaner, and it was clear from the way he talked about him that the grief hadn't caught up with him yet either, that he was still operating in the same suspended procedural mode I'd been living in since the funeral. He told me my son had come to him about 8 months earlier, quiet and unsettled, asking questions about how joint accounts worked, how deeds got transferred, what kind of paper trail existed if someone wanted to prove later that money had moved somewhere it shouldn't have. At the time, the business partner told me he'd assumed it was some kind of estate planning, the normal paranoia of a man whose company had finally started making real money. It wasn't until after the funeral that he'd started putting together what my son had actually been circling. He told me about the early years too, things I'd never heard. My son sleeping in the office some nights because he couldn't afford both rent and payroll in the same month, the two of them splitting a single delivery route between them for almost a year before the company could support real drivers. He used to talk about you a lot back then, he said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. Said his old man could fix anything with his hands, and he was going to build something his old man could be proud of even if he never fully understood the spreadsheets. I hadn't known that. It sat heavy in my chest for the rest of the conversation. We spent 2 hours at that diner going through copies of everything he had, most of which matched what I'd already found in the storage unit, some of which filled in gaps. He confirmed the timeline in the emails, told me he'd sat in on part of one of those early legal consultations without realizing at the time what he was actually hearing, back when my son's wife had asked him to come along under the story that it was about updating some paperwork related to the business. He said something about the way she'd talked in that meeting, calm, organized, already 3 steps ahead, that had stuck with him ever since without him being able to say exactly why. Toward the end of the conversation, he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that my son had talked about setting aside a second set of records somewhere, something separate from the folders in case the first batch ever got discovered and dismissed as incomplete. Neither of us could remember him saying where. He said my son had used the phrase, "in case she finds the first layer," during one of their last conversations, a phrase that hadn't meant much to the business partner at the time and meant considerably more to both of us now, sitting in that diner booth with cold coffee in front of us. I told him about the box, the folders, the letter, and he asked if I'd gone through everything in it or just the top layer. I hadn't thought about it that way until he asked. I'd been so consumed by the capacity proceedings folder that I hadn't finished looking through the rest of what was sitting under it. We agreed on a plan that felt, at the time, like enough. He knew an attorney who specialized in elder financial protection, a different kind of lawyer than the one my son's wife had been quietly consulting, someone who dealt with exactly this kind of scheme from the other side of it. We would take what we had, the transfers, the email chain, the deed, and we would put a stop to the capacity filing before it ever reached a judge. It felt, driving home that night, like the worst of it was already behind me. The attorney moved fast once we brought him the folders. Within a week, a formal letter went out to my son's wife and her attorney, laying out what we had, the transfer records, the timeline of the consultations, the deed showing my name already attached to the rental property months before any competency question could reasonably be raised. The letter made it clear that any attempt to file for guardianship over my affairs would be met immediately with evidence of a deliberately engineered scheme, and that the firm representing me was prepared to make that evidence part of the public record. She called me herself 2 days after the letter went out, which surprised me. I'd expected her to hide behind lawyers entirely. Her voice on the phone was different than it had been in the lawyer's office, sharper, faster, none of the composed grief left in it at all. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said. "I was trying to help you. Everyone said you weren't handling things well, and I was trying to make sure you'd be taken care of." I told her I'd read the emails. I told her I knew exactly what kind of help she'd been arranging for 5 months before my son ever died. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, and I heard something crack underneath the composure that hadn't cracked once since the day we buried him, a thin edge of panic she hadn't planned for. "You're old. You're grieving. You don't understand contracts. You don't understand what any of that paperwork actually says." I told her I understood plenty. I told her 31 years of reading contractors' fine print had taught me exactly what a scheme looks like when somebody's trying to cheat me, and I knew a plan when I saw one laid out in writing. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought she'd hung up, and then she said, quieter now, that she'd dropped the whole thing, that she didn't want to fight, that she'd never intended for it to look the way it looked on paper. 2 weeks later, her attorney sent formal confirmation that the capacity petition had been withdrawn before it was ever filed. My attorney called it a clean resolution. My son's business partner called it a win. For a few days, driving that SUV back and forth to appointments I didn't really need just to keep moving, I let myself believe it was over. For almost 3 weeks, nothing happened, and I let the quiet convince me the worst of it was finally behind me. I started sleeping through the night again, something that had eluded me completely in the weeks right after the funeral. I drove the SUV out to the cemetery most Sundays and sat in the parking lot for a while before going in, not ready yet to walk up to the stone, but closer to ready than I'd been. I started doing small repairs around my own house again, the kind of jobs I'd been putting off since long before the funeral, replacing a fixture in the hallway, resetting a breaker that had been tripping for months. It felt good to have my hands on something simple again, something with a clear cause and a clear fix, after months of paperwork that never seemed to resolve into anything solid. It was my son's business partner partner, who called with the thing that unraveled the quiet. He'd been helping me get my own accounts in order, mostly out of a guilt he never said out loud, but that I could hear underneath everything he offered to do for me, and he'd suggested almost in passing that we pull a full credit report just to make sure nothing strange was sitting on it after everything that had happened. I told him I didn't see the point. My finances had always been simple: a checking account, a small pension, the house I'd already paid off years ago. There wasn't anything there worth looking at. He pulled it anyway. He called me back 2 days later, and his voice had none of the relief in it that I'd gotten used to hearing over the past few weeks. "I need you to sit down," he said, "and I need you to tell me if you remember opening any lines of credit in the last 2 years. Any of them, even small ones." I told him I hadn't opened anything. I hadn't needed to. He was quiet on the line for a moment, and then he read me a list of account numbers I had never seen in my life. 3 separate lines of credit and a personal loan, all opened under my name, all still active, all carrying balances that made my chest go tight in a way it hadn't gone tight since the day I stood in that storage unit for the first time. We met at his office the next morning, and he had the full report printed out and spread across his desk like an X-ray. Every account highlighted in yellow, dates circled in red pen. The 3 lines of credit had been opened 18, 14, and 9 months earlier, each one a few weeks apart from a payment on something else, each one small enough on its own that no single statement would have looked alarming if I'd ever seen one, which I never had, because every one of them was tied to a billing address that wasn't mine. A post office box 2 towns over, in a town I had no reason to ever drive through. The personal loan was the largest piece of it, taken out 11 months earlier. The same month my son had quietly deeded half the rental property into my name. $214,000 dispersed directly into an account that had since been closed. My son's business partner had already done enough digging by the time I arrived to know that account had fed into the same web of transfers we'd found in the storage unit folder months earlier, money moving in small, deliberate steps towards somewhere neither of us could fully trace yet. I sat there staring at the yellow highlighter marks and thought about every form I had ever signed for my son over the years, every time I'd co-signed something small when he was starting the business, every piece of paperwork where I'd let his wife handle the details because it was easier to trust family than to read every line myself. Somewhere in all of that trust, she'd gotten what she needed: a signature, a social security number written down for some innocuous reason years earlier and never thought about again, the raw material for building a version of me on paper that I'd never once seen. By then he'd already pulled the closed accounts transaction history, and he walked me through it page by page, most of the money moving out in payments to a contractor 2 counties over, a kitchen renovation, new flooring throughout, a pool installed the previous summer at a house I'd never once been invited to see. None of it was in my name on paper. All of it, on paper, had been paid for with money borrowed against my name. "This isn't sloppy," he said, tapping the highlighted rows. "Sloppy people get caught by accident. This is somebody who knew exactly how far she could stretch it before anyone would think to look." It was the business partner who said it out loud first, sitting across that desk with the highlighted report between us, before I'd fully let myself put the pieces together in the same order he had. "The capacity filing wasn't about the rental property," he said slowly, like he was working through it as he spoke. "It was never really about that at all. It was about who gets to make decisions once you can't." I didn't understand at first. He explained it the way you'd explain a wiring diagram to someone who'd never opened a panel before. Patient, methodical, laying out each connection one at a time. If the guardianship petition had gone through, if a judge had signed off on the idea that I could no longer be trusted to run my own life, she wouldn't just have gained control over one rental property. She would have become the person legally authorized to manage everything in my name, including debt, including $214,000 in loans and lines of credit that existed only because she had built them there herself, one signature at a time, over 2 years, waiting for the moment they would become someone else's problem to solve. He walked me through the last piece slowly, tapping each highlighted line as he went. "Once a guardian is appointed," he explained, "they can settle debts using the ward's assets without needing that person's consent for each transaction, because the entire point of the arrangement is that the court has already decided the ward can't be trusted to consent to anything. The rental property, the pension, whatever equity I had left in the house I'd already paid off years ago, all of it would have become available to satisfy a debt she had manufactured herself, and I would have had no legal voice in the room while it happened. Not because anyone had proven I couldn't manage my own money, because a judge had been shown exactly enough carefully assembled paperwork to believe that I couldn't. She hadn't been planning to seize a piece of property from a grieving old man too broken to notice. She had been building a debt in my name for 2 years, patiently, invisibly, the way you run a wire behind a wall where nobody will ever think to look, and the capacity petition was never the crime. It was the mechanism. It was how she intended to make sure that when the debt finally came due, I would have no legal standing left to refuse paying it, because by then, a judge would have already ruled that I no longer had the right to refuse anything. She wasn't planning to protect me. She was planning to make me liable for what she owed. I sat in that office for a long time after he stopped talking, running the wiring diagram through my head over and over, looking for the flaw in it, the way I always looked for the flaw before I trusted a diagnosis. I never found one. Every connection held. The attorney who had handled the first letter told us this was no longer a case for a stern warning and a withdrawn petition. $214,000 in loans opened under a false address using someone else's identifying information wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was fraud, plain and documented, the kind of thing that involved a bank's internal investigators and, eventually, a detective from Financial Crimes who took my statement in a small windowless room and didn't ask a single question I couldn't answer honestly. The bank's fraud investigator moved through the accounts methodically once she had the full picture, matching signatures against samples I provided, tracing the closed account back to where the money had actually gone, most of it into renovations on a house 2 towns over that my son's wife had quietly purchased under a name that wasn't quite hers, a maiden name from before the marriage that nobody had thought to check. She showed me a signature comparison at one point, mine beside the forged version on one of the loan applications, close enough to fool a bank teller glancing at it for 10 seconds, nowhere close enough to survive an actual forensic review. The detective told me, in the flat professional tone of someone who has said this exact sentence to 100 other people before me, that identity theft between family members was more common than most people wanted to believe, and almost always easier to prove once someone finally started looking in the right direction. It took another 6 weeks to build the case to the point where the detective felt confident bringing it to a prosecutor. 6 weeks of pulling records from 3 different banks. 6 weeks of the fraud investigator matching dates on the loan applications against dates from the capacity proceedings email chain, showing beyond any real doubt that the 2 schemes had been running on the same clock the entire time. One financial and one legal, each one designed to make the other easier to pull off. By the time the arrest warrant was signed, there wasn't a single loose thread left for anyone to pull on in her defense. She was arrested on a Tuesday morning at the house I had helped my son paint, in front of the same door where she'd stood at the reception, accepting condolences with dry eyes and a composed, gracious sadness that had fooled almost everyone in that room except me, and even I hadn't understood, not fully, not yet, exactly what I'd been looking at. I drove out to the storage unit one more time, months after all of it, once the bank had reversed the loans and the detective's case had moved fully into the hands of a prosecutor who told me, in a phone call I mostly just listened to, that the evidence was about as clean as evidence ever gets. Unit 14 was empty now except for the folding table and the lamp, still unplugged, still waiting for a purpose it had already served. I sat down on the same overturned crate and thought about the last real conversation I'd ever had with my son, the one about the old service truck sitting in his garage. Hang on to that. And I finally understood what he'd actually been telling me, not to keep an old truck out of sentiment, to keep something, anything, that was fully and only mine, something with a title that couldn't be quietly signed over or borrowed against without my knowledge, because somewhere in the last 2 years of his life, he had already started to suspect that everything else might eventually be used against the both of us. I thought about all the times he'd called me about small, strange things in those last months, questions about paperwork, questions about old accounts, and how I'd assumed it was just a busy man being thorough. He'd been building me a way out the entire time, one quiet, careful step ahead of a woman neither of us had fully understood until it was almost too late. I drove the SUV back out of that gravel lot in the last light of the afternoon, past the fairgrounds, past the diner where the coffee had gone cold 100 times since I'd last had a reason to stop there, past the exit I still automatically wanted to take toward the house on the hill that wasn't mine to go home to anymore. My hands weren't shaking anymore. For the first time since the funeral, sitting behind the wheel of the one thing my son had left specifically for me to find, I understood exactly what he'd been trying to protect, and it had never been the rental property or the trust fund or any number sitting in an account somewhere. It had been me.